Senator Black.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Secretary, in your comments on religious freedom, I just want to say I look forward to the new leadership there. I think we've been wanting in that area in the Department, and I was pleased to be supportive of the person that was nominated that's going there now. I also was pleased when you used the words religious freedom. I think in too much of our discussion with countries around the world, we've talked about the right to worship, which is a different thing than religious freedom, and I'm glad to see any language that expands that, and I see a couple of questions on the faces of people behind you. It might be a good test to have at the State Department someday. What is the difference in the right to worship and religious freedom? What's the difference in freedom to worship and religious freedom? And there is a difference, and it's I'm sure you understand it, and I don't want to take a lot of time with that, but I'm pleased to hear you using that language. In both Iraq and in Yemen, I'm wondering what your view is of why we missed the level of how quickly those countries could change direction. In Iraq, at one point we were referring to ISIS or whatever you want to call it. We're all talking about the same group as a junior varsity, not quite up to the A game. A few months later, they control a substantial amount of the country. In September in Yemen, the President saying this is a great example of the success of our policy, and 6 months later, we're evacuating the embassy. Why do you think we missed? What do you think we missed? What have we learned about the world today that maybe is different than the world 10 years ago that leads us to come to those conclusions that turn out to be so wrong so quickly?
Well, in a sense, they weren't altogether wrong all the time. Let me be precise.
I remember what I'm going to ask, of course, is surely Yemen is no longer the quintessential example of our positive success in foreign policy. So,
well, I don't think I ever called it that, but
I think the President said this was a good example of our successful policy in September.
Well, what he was talking about, in all fairness, Senator, the President was talking about a way to not get in the middle of something and still be able to carry out your CT objectives, and that's what it was. He was talking about a model of our ability to be able to fight al-Qaeda and to deal with that problem. Now, that relied on cooperation with the government, and we had a platform from which we were working, and it was effective. What did surprise, and it surprised everybody, and by the way, including Iranians and Saudis, whose backyard, in many respects, certainly the Saudi backyard, the Iranians reaching across it, but it surprised everybody that it moved the way it did. And one of the reasons it moved the way it did is a very simple rule that we have learned many times over. I can go back to countless countries and countless revolutions where the United States picked somebody and they didn't pan out. And in, what we can't control is the quality of governance. And in Iraq, what you had was a serious process of deterioration. I went back and re-looked at sort of the figures, because there had been some accusations, well, the troops came out too soon and this and that. They weren't combat troops. There was no talk ever of leaving combat troops, ever. So combat troops wouldn't have made the difference. The question is, what kind of military did you have? What kind of leadership did you have? And who did they represent? And what were they capable of doing? And that was steadily deteriorating, because you had a prime minister who was putting his cronies in, using it as a personal tool, and excluding a good part of the country. So when Daesh came along in Mosul, people didn't want to fight, because you had a Shia presence in the Sunni part of the country, fighting Sunnis, and they said, this is their fight, we're out of here. And there was no discipline and no capacity to do it. So a lot of lessons learned from that about inclusivity and having a stake in the process. And
the ability to resist.
And the ability to resist, absolutely.
Let me move to
Senator,
another.
that's really, and that lesson is really being applied now in the efforts to try to create greater unity and capacity to be able to push back and fight back and deal with the issue of governance. Same thing in Yemen. Yemen, you had Hadi, who just, didn't deliver, and you had Saleh, the former president, who was present, creating enormous mischief underneath him with the people that he still had who were allied with him, working with the Houthis, and now they're at each other's throats at odds for contesting for power. There's an effort to create a dialogue now that will...
Secretary, let me ask one question at least on Iran. I hear that. I think I asked the counterterrorism head the other day the same question and basically said we overestimated the ability of the incumbent governments to resist, and I think you're saying that same thing, and I appreciate that answer. In Iran, the chairman had a long list of countries that he asked you about where Iran is influencing in a negative way. What do you think happens if we put Iran on a clock toward nuclear capacity? How do you think others in the neighborhood react? If there's a 10-year window, or I don't want to argue about the window, if there is a clock of some kind where Iran within a certain understood period of time could become nuclear capable, if they tell us they're going to become nuclear capable, that 12-month clock or whatever it is, how do the Saudis react? Leaving the Israelis out for a minute, do other countries react in a way that allows Iran to become nuclear capable without thinking they have to move in that direction as well? When you and I visited at the Munich Security Conference a year ago, I told you I didn't think you could contain enrichment, and I still don't, but I'd be glad to hear your answer to that.
Well, that's the test, obviously, Senator. It's a very good question, and we ought to spend a little moment on it just because it really is central to all of this. First of all, we are not deliberating whether or not to give Iran a nuclear capacity. If by nuclear capacity we are both talking about a peaceful, nuclear power-oriented program, not a weapons program, just nuclear power. Iran already has that kind of nuclear capacity. They have what they allege is a peaceful program. We've had questions about that, very serious ones. But they have nuclear capacity. They know how to enrich. They've already learned how to do it. By the way, they learned how to do it in another administration's tenure. Back in 2003, Iran had 164 centrifuges. Today, they claim some 27,000. There are 19,000 of them that are out there working, or capable of working. There are less than that working today. So they have a nuclear capacity. They got it. They got it a number of years ago when an administration, by the way, had a policy of no enrichment at all. That was the administration's policy. Was that enforced? Did anything happen while they went from 164 centrifuges to 27,000? No. They're where they are. So we're taking the program that we've got today, and what we're committed to try to do is make absolutely certain, hopefully in a fail-safe manner, as fail-safe as you can be in nuclear policy, that they cannot develop a bomb, as distinguished from a peaceful nuclear power program. Now, they've agreed, and it's much unnoticed and unpaid attention to live by the NPT. They could pull out of the NPT. North Korea is not in the NPT. That's one of the problems. But Iran is in the NPT. And right now, the IAEA has documented that they have lived by every single requirement of the interim agreement. They've taken their 20% enriched uranium and they've reduced it to 0. They've opened up Fordow, the underground facility, to inspection daily. They've opened up Natanz. They've opened up Arak. They've stopped Arak. Not one feature of Arak has been advanced from the day we made this agreement. So in effect, I won't go into the numbers, but a certain number of months of, quote, breakout time has now been grown larger. Israel is safer today than Israel was before we signed the interim agreement. And we're trying to come to an agreement which will, in fact, expand that time even further so that if they were to try to break out, we will know. And then the test is, how do you know you'll know? How do you have sufficient ability to be able to have the inspection and intrusion necessary to do that? That's our job. That's what we're trying to do now. So we can come to you and say, and to Israel and to the Arab world in the community, we will have the ability to know what they're doing sufficiently that they can't break out. And if they did break out, we have the same options available to us to whack them, do whatever you want, as we have today. Now, that makes it a very difficult negotiation. It is a difficult negotiation. But Iran has lived up to its agreement. And our hope is that they will do the things necessary to prove they have a peaceful program and give us an assurance that there isn't some capacity to go covert to slide it off. And I think it's really important to see it. Now, are other countries nervous about what may or may not happen? Sure, of course they are. And it's our job to sit with them and show them what we're doing and have them hopefully understand the full measure of it. Now, we have a 1, 2, 3 agreement with the Emirates. They've already agreed to enter into some kind of a peaceful process. And obviously, if a program is peaceful, there's going to be a lot more nuclear discussion in the years ahead because I assume if and when people all get serious about climate change, it's a zero emissions form of production, and it may become more affordable and more attractive to people in various parts of the world instead of fossil fuels. So we'll see where we go. But we're trying to create a template here that can withstand public scrutiny to show that they can't produce a weapon. One final comment. I know I went over my time, but this is important. This concept of breakout is not understood well enough, and there are a lot of reasons for that. In the 80s, when I was in the Senate, in the 90s, we were debating international arms control agreements. And breakout then used to mean your ability, we thought, to sort of deliver a weapon. Breakout in the context we've been talking about it with respect to Iran and its program does not mean that. Breakout is the amount of time it takes to develop enough fissile material for one weapon. We're trying to get a year for some period of time that we can guarantee that, and then enough time afterwards that everybody is comfortable that they really just can't go do this without our knowing it. Because we're going to be tracing the uranium trade. Now, I don't want to go into all the details. It's inappropriate for me to do that while we're negotiating. But suffice it to say that we're going to try to have sufficient understanding. But once you have the 1 year to be able to have enough fissile material, you still got to go design a means of delivery and a means of explosive. That could take 4, 5, 6 years. So we think we're building an incredible, no country in the world has ever had the kind of restraint that we're sort of talking about. We'll see what happens.